Hello, in this video I want to talk about secondary dominance. Now, again, in the last set of videos we did talk about secondary dominance, and last semester we certainly encountered secondary dominance in rock and pop style, and especially, as I said before, in the music of the Beatles, where there are a number of times when you have secondary dominance. So this information is not necessarily new information, but it doesn't hurt to review it. And we are going to look specifically in the context of four-part harmony writing. How might you voice a secondary dominant? How might you use a secondary dominant in a four-part common practice voicing? So we'll look at that as well, and that might be slightly new. But first of all then, a little review. Let's imagine that we have looked at a piece of music and we have determined that these are the chords that are being used in that piece of music. We'll say also that we've determined that this piece is very definitely in F major. And we're comfortable with that. Because it is important when we get into secondary dominance that we understand we are not changing key. We might be on the verge of changing key sometimes, but we've not actually changed key. We start and we end in a particular key. We are just adding color through the use of these things called secondary dominance. Now, if we were to look at this chord progression, we would want to say to ourselves, well, how do we interpret this with Roman numerals? How can we make sense of this? And some of these chords make perfect sense to us. This chord, obviously in this key, F major, this first chord must be a 1 chord, no problems there. However, when we get to the second chord here, we see an A7 chord. That means that is an A major minor 7 chord. That doesn't make sense in F major. This chord would have to be A, C sharp, E, G, and there is no C sharp in F major. So this chord does not fit chromatically in the key. It does not fit harmonically, it does not fit diatonically in the key. I said chromatically back there. I should have said it does not fit diatonically in the key. It needs to be justified as a chromatic chord. It has a C sharp, which is a chromatically altered note in it. And therefore, we need to think about how can we justify that chord in this key. Well, we're not going to worry about it right now. We're going to go on and see if there are other chords we can identify. We'll come back to the ones we can't. Well, the next chord is a D minor chord. No problem there. That's a 6 chord. The next chord is a G7 chord. That one's a problem because, again, G, B natural, D, F does not fit in F major. You would expect it to be a G, B flat, D, F chord, and then it would be a 2-7 chord, and there'd be no problem with it. It would fit diatonically. But if it has a B natural in it, which is what G7 tells us, it's a G major minor 7 chord, then it doesn't fit in the key. So we have to come back to it. The C7 chord, however, is fine. That's C, E, G, B flat, no problem there. We don't have a problem with that in any way, shape, or form. That's just a 5-7 chord. And then the F chord is a 1 chord again, no problems there. So when it comes to justifying these chords, we would probably go through a list. We might say to ourselves, well, are any of them Neapolitan 6 chords? Are they built in the lowered 2nd scale degree? Are they augmented triads? You know, there would be things that we already know that we would be looking at to rule out those things before we jump to the conclusion that they might be secondary dominants. However, one key element to being able to tell if these are secondary dominants is seeing how they work in context with the keys around, with the chords around them. So, for example, we might look at this one, A7, and we would say to ourselves, this A7 doesn't fit in this key, but is there a relationship, a possible relationship between A7 and, say, D minor? Well, if we were in the key of D minor, A would be our dominant. D minor being our tonic for a moment, D, F, A would be our dominant. And so there would be in D minor a 5-7 to 1 relationship. So if there's a 5-to-1 relationship in D minor, we can suggest, that suggests to us that this might be a secondary dominant. It's not the primary dominant. Remember, the primary dominant in a key is the dominant of that key, in this case C7. But it is on a secondary level, it is a secondary dominant. Sometimes these are called temporary dominants because this is temporarily making this feel like tonic, but it's only for a moment. So A7 to D is a 5-to-1 relationship. This, however, is not 1, so it is not a 5-to-1 relationship, but a 5 of 6 going to the 6th chord. So this is not 5-to-1 in D minor, because we're not in D minor. In this key, this is a 6th chord. So this is 5 of 6, which goes to 6. In the same way, we might look at these two chords. We would say, now, is there a relationship between G and C? Well, yes, indeed. There's a relationship between G and C. That, if we were in C major, G would be our 5 chord. There would be a dominant to tonic relationship. This could be 5, 7 to 1 in C major. Now, you wouldn't have C7 in C major, but the roots exist in a 5-to-1 relationship. So therefore, we can say to ourselves, well, maybe then this is a secondary dominant. It's not the dominant in this key, but it's a dominant of a chord in this key. So this is a 5-to-1, but this is not 1, it's 5, so this must be instead 5, 7 of 5, going to 5, and then making its way in the end to 1. So this is the principle of secondary dominance. We've already looked at this should be review, but you get the idea that there is a secondary dominant relationship, a 5-to-1 relationship between these particular chords. Now if we go over here, we see how this would play out in a 4-part context. Here, I've already analysed most of this, but I've left one set here, one chord here, I've left unanalyzed. If we were just looking at the top here and we were trying to give Roman numerals, we would say, okay, that's a 1 chord, this is a 2 chord in first inversion, it's actually a 2-7 chord, so it would actually be a 2-6-5 chord. You would have to properly identify all the notes. Then we have this chord, there's an E7 chord. There's something strange about this chord. You can even see it here once you write it out. You can see there's a chromatic. This note does not exist in the key. We're in D major. You shouldn't have a G sharp. So there's something odd about this chord. Then we get into this chord here. This is an A7 chord, and it is perfectly fine in the key. A, C sharp, E, G. No problems with that. The G is here connecting these two chords, but there's nothing wrong with that. And then finally we get a D1 chord. No problems there. So this is the one where we have an issue. This chord doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't make sense in the key of D, but again, if we were to look at E in relation to A, it does make sense. E is the dominant of A. So you can therefore say, well, if there's a dominant tonic relationship here, then this would be 5 in the key of A, but A is not 1, A is actually 5, so this must be a 5, 6, 5, just an inversion of a 7 chord, of 5, going to 5, going to 1. So in this context, you simply make sure that you've put the right accidentals in to create the chords you need, and keep the voice leading as smooth as possible. Look how super smooth this voice leading is. This E comes down here, it stays, and then it goes on down to a D. This D remains in place because it's the 7th of the chord here. It's the 7th of the secondary dominant. It moves down by step, and off we go. The tenor line, super smooth, connected all the way. And the bass line leaps a little bit at the beginning, but then moves very smoothly up before coming to the final cadence. Very smooth voice leading, everything works exactly as you would expect. The secondary dominant is just kind of inserted in. It fits in place right before the chord that it's making feel like a tonic, and the voice leading is as smooth as you can possibly make it. You'll find that when you start using secondary dominants, the voice leading really becomes very smooth, especially if you use the secondary dominant in an inversion. I should really have written this over G sharp here to clarify that that is in inversion. And if you start using secondary dominants in root position and in various inversions, you can have some super smooth voice leading that is also very colorful because it uses these secondary dominant chromatic chords that just kind of add a nice feel to the texture and a vibrancy and a life to your harmonizations that you don't otherwise have. So we'll look at this, of course, in much more detail in class, but I wanted to make the video so that you've at least got something you can come back to. You can hear me say these things more than once. You can look at the examples on the board a few times, and we can kind of talk about where you don't get it or you have questions in class, and hopefully move the discussion forward from there. So, secondary dominance, make sure you get this. If you don't, make sure you're clear on the questions you have, bring those to class, let's get it figured out, and we'll move forward from there. Thank you.